No, no, way back the early Sunday morning hours. Yeah, so I think that
Yeah. Let's check 1, 2. Yep.
Well, Mark Christian preached on Pilate anyhow.
Pardon me?
Mark Christian preached on Pilate anyhow. He kind of covered the rest of it.
Well, well, you know, your comments combined with his comments, even expand the picture. Awesome. I never heard this guy, Sejanus. I mean, Josephus, yeah, I've heard of him, you know. Sejanus guy was completely new to me.
He's an interesting character. Whether it's Pilate's motivation or not, I don't know. That's just a highlight. We'll go 50-50. It's coming right with the thoughts.
It's just another stroke on the picture.
Those political pressures. Oh, yeah. Just like today.
It makes it.
Makes it which is what same last story tonight this morning. We walked outside and walked outside. There were space outside of the classroom. Oh, that's unfortunate. Somebody needs to do this class. Flannel board Jesus is what I used to say. They don't know what a flannel board is.
Mark referred to that often. And I mean, I covered that era.
Yeah, me too. I'm the last of that era. I'm the last to use the typewriter. I used the typewriter.
Yeah.
I'm the last. In fact, they took them out the year after I was done.
IBM Selectric wasn't
The electric one with the racing one. We have it. I use it. But I also have a Commodore here at home when I was older. So I'm right around technology.
I did this the year before I was in high school. Got no sympathy whatsoever. I will never let it do.
Oh, it's funny.
All right. All right, friends. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening. Once again, thank you all. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to kind of stand like here a little bit closer to some of you who did not want to sit at this table. Hey, as we get going, obviously we are in Holy Week. And so one of the things we want to do is just reflect and review on the events that took place this week, obviously during the life of Christ. And so if we were to review, we're Wednesday. When it comes to Wednesday, this is the second day where Jesus has been teaching in the temple. A lot of controversy with the Jewish leaders. That took place Tuesday into Wednesday. Of course, then tomorrow we go into the Passover day where the disciples are going to prepare for the Passover, get the Airbnb in Jerusalem, and celebrate the Passover meal. That'll lead us into Friday. We know Good Friday and the events that take place there. That's where we are in our study together, are the events that take place on Friday. And our time together, in last week's session together, we were talking about Pilate. And if you were here on Sunday, you heard Mark's sermon. I want to just highlight again his outline. Because one of the things Mark did really well this Sunday was to summarize some of Pilate's motivations. And some of the conversations we had, of course, last week on Wednesday. And so the three things that Mark said were the motivations of Pilate. The first thing he said was Pilate was passive, right? Pilate washed his hands of Jesus. Really wanted nothing to do with him. Tried to pass him off to Herod Antipas and tried to say, hey, he's part of your jurisdiction. I want nothing to do with him. And I appreciated that because we definitely see that with Pilate. In fact, 7 to 10 times we mentioned, Pilate says, I find no fault in him. Right? This man is innocent. And so the second thing that Mark pointed out this last Sunday, again, if you were here, is this dynamic where when it comes to Pilate that he was, anyone remember the second word? What's the second word for Sunday? Okay. One of the words is selfish. And the third word was be fearful. So selfish, that Pilate was selfish. And we mentioned the fact that Pilate in many ways felt threatened when it comes to his political position and his security. Whether Sejanus was involved in that, I don't know. But I do know this, when the Jewish leaders say, you are no friend of Caesar's if you let him go, he feels threatened. He's fearful of that and selfish in the sense that he wants to self-preserve. And so we see those three characterizations of Pilate in the text as we've walked through it last week. One of the things that Pilate says about Jesus is he says, so you are a king then? And Jesus is like, yes, but not the kind of king you're thinking, right? My kingdom doesn't have borders. Not the same kind of king as what a worldly king or earthly king would imagine. In fact, I gave you a passage out of Luke that says, yeah, my kingdom is observable, but you wouldn't say, here it is, there it is. It's among you. It's like salt and yeast and light. It kind of infiltrates everything, but you couldn't exactly just point to it and go, there it is. And that is the nature of even the kingdom today, isn't it? Is that sometimes you look around and you go, where is the church? And you're kind of like, it's just kind of infiltrating everywhere if it's doing what it should be doing. And of course, we come to the end then of Pilate's trial with Jesus and the pressure that he is under. He finally relinquishes and sends Jesus to be crucified. That's where we pick up today. And so in the text today, one of the things that's going to take place with Jesus is he's going to be flogged. Some scholars argue that Jesus is whipped and then flogged. That he earlier on in the trial, according to all four Gospels together, receives a whipping that would be more of like a punishment you kind of see maybe on TV. And then he's presented, hey, isn't this punishment enough? But then later on, he's actually scourged, which is the word Matthew uses and kind of what we're used to seeing depicted. I don't know. Scholars don't know, but that's a theory. We do know that Jesus was flogged. And so I want to talk about some of that for just a minute. I know Mark on Sunday was trying to be sensitive. I do think it's important for us to understand some of the historical background of how Romans treated victims of crucifixion. And so this morning, I actually had the opportunity to walk outside with 40 students at Ozark in my Life of Christ class. And we reenacted in the sense of just telling the story as we walked around campus some of these moments. And some of my students afterwards said, wow, I knew it was real, but for some reason walking outside and talking about this made it seem more real. So one of the things I do want to do with this is build a historical background around it, but I also don't want to strip away the focus on Jesus. Last week we focused on Pilate, we focused on the political leaders, we focused on the trials. This week I want us to focus in on Jesus himself, like what's going on for him. And so I'm going to pray, and that's how we're going to start tonight, is with the scene of Jesus being handed over to be flogged. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity we have to come and study, to set aside time, even perhaps especially this week, God, to reflect, to remember, even if some of the details are details we are familiar with. I pray that they are details that can remind us of the weightiness of our own sin, but even more importantly, the weightiness of your grace. And so may we remember in a way, God, that glorifies Jesus and not just historical details or facts. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Weird way to start. When I was in Colorado in high school, I went sledding with a friend. This was in the mountains of Colorado. Sledding in the mountains of Colorado is not a normal way to sled. We were sledding down full mountains. So we built a slalom that went all the way down the mountains. And the two of us, high school football players, decided we would race each other down this sledding course that we had built. So his name was Jeremy. He's still a good friend of mine. We put sleds side by side and we start racing down. As he kind of realizes I'm going to beat him, because I usually do, as we're racing down, he starts to take his foot outside of the sled and kick my sled to make it go off course. So I'm kind of like doing this, going down the mountain. Eventually we go around a corner, and I'm on the outside of the corner up toward the top of a bank, and he sees his opportunity, and he kicks me one final time, and I go off the edge. At this point, I'm turning into like one of those cartoon human snowballs, right, just tumbling down the mountain. And it's not all that dramatic, but I landed pretty hard, right? And when I did, my hand was down in the snow, kind of buried down in a bank. And when I went to push myself up, something caught. Like I could tell, like my glove was caught on something. I had to kind of just give an extra little pull. And when I did, I pulled my hand up and noticed cotton sticking out of my black glove. There was a hole in my black glove, and there was cotton sticking out of it. And then I remember this moment. Almost instantly, that white cotton turned red. Right? And so I knew, the blood is coming through this cotton. So I take off my glove, and I have this hole in my hand, right? I had landed underneath the bank. There was a tree there, a branch sticking up out of that tree that had been broken off, basically a spike in the ground that Jeremy had impaled me on in that particular moment. And so I remember kind of having that, like, I'm going to pass out kind of moment. I'm not really a Dr. Stitch's blood guy. Those of you medical people in the room, thank you. But I remember just like taking snow and packing it and like going back into the house and being like, I'm fine, I'll put a Band-Aid on it. Probably should have had stitches. And I tell that story sometimes in a dramatic fashion for, I don't know, high school students. And I get the same reaction that some of you did, like, oh. And it's a cheap shot, but can I do a preacher cheap shot? I know that I don't always react that way when we talk about the crucifixion of Jesus, right? Communion time comes around. And I don't always have that same response. And it's a cheap shot. I get it. There was a preacher who did it to me when I was a kid, so I'm like, I'm going to do it to other people now that I have this story, right? And the reality is tonight is, yeah, we can get into the gross details, and it might cause you to go, ooh, but unless it causes you to go, oh, wow, then you don't get it, right? There's something about Jesus that causes us to recognize that his shameful, excruciating death on the cross was a penalty for our sin, and we probably had to have an reaction to our sin if it's going to be an appropriate reaction, because our sin cost something. I would even argue that when it comes to forgiving other people or receiving forgiveness, it's not that we receive or give forgiveness because sin wasn't really that big of a deal. No, we give forgiveness and get forgiveness because Jesus is such a big deal. And so we can forgive people not because what they did doesn't really matter or didn't really hurt us. No, it might have really hurt us. But because the cross of Jesus is so valuable or so great. And so I want to have kind of this reaction tonight to say, boy, how great a thing that Jesus did, and how great a sin that we are guilty of, and therefore how great a grace that Jesus gives. And that's a bit of that reaction. So Pilate hands Jesus over to be flogged. One of the things that Mark's gospel points out is, once again, we have a cohort or a battalion of Roman soldiers around Jesus. Mark's gospel points out that this is kind of the back lot of Pilate's praetorium. So he's removed from the public sensibilities. And if that battalion or cohort word, again, is a technical word for the Romans, we're again talking about 460 to 600 or so soldiers who are there mocking Jesus as a king. Are they soldiers who are local? No, these are not, right? These are either transcriptions, people brought in, likely from the region, but they see the people of Jerusalem as sometimes contemptible. So it's not that big of a deal to see Jesus as less than maybe human, or at least as an enemy combatant. Let's get honest with it. And so they mock him as such. You want to be a king? We'll make you a king. We'll make fun of you. We'll give you a nice little cape, a nice little crown. We'll give you a staff. We'll hit you with it, and we'll bow down to you and venerate you. Obviously, there's some irony with this because he really is the king. And so it's in an upside-down reversal world way. Jesus is actually getting venerated as a king, mocked, but still recognized as a king. And so it's this tragic event that takes place. And you can kind of picture, is it 400, 600? Doesn't really matter. But you can kind of picture just guys coming and taking their turn because of their frustration and their vent-up violence. We see this in the modern day news headlines all of the time. So a Roman flogging, one of the things that you probably know, and it's maybe just helpful to review even if you don't. Sometimes Roman floggings are confused with a couple things. First, Roman floggings are confused with Jewish law, which says you can only receive 39 lashings and up to 40. And that's actually not a Roman concern. Their concern with this flogging is to bring you as close to death as possible to expedite the time on the cross. Now, like what took place in Nazi Germany, the Romans experimented on people when it came to crucifying them. Right? They would experiment with different kinds of death and different methods of torture. This is what they did. So not every flogging, not every crucifixion was the same. Because, you didn't fabricate the whip in a factory. You made it on the front lines. You didn't make a cross in some warehouse. You found the material that was local and there. And so as we talk about flogging and crucifixion, I want you to hear those details. But typically, the other thing that's also confused is the whip called a cat of nine tails. That's actually the whip 1700s Navy. Their whip was called a cat of nine tails. It was based on the Roman whip. But this whip would have 3 to sometimes 9 different straps. Scholars tell us and archaeology tells us that they would weave knuckle bones of goats and sheep into these oftentimes. Sometimes broken pieces of pottery or rock that they found. You can kind of imagine if you were wanting to create the most amount of damage as possible that you could find material to weave into this whip. It was typically a shorter whip. It was more of a precision blunt instrument than like a long whip like we think of in the movies, like whoosh, Indiana Jones like of whip. This whip was more to be able to hit in the right spot. So a couple different ways that a person would be flogged. One would be like a podium like this. You see this depicted in a few different movies. A person would have their body laid over the top of it, right? And their hands would be strapped down, their feet would be strapped down, but their back would be taut and exposed. You can kind of see the arch of a back. The other way would be, you see this depicted sometimes in movies, like their hands would be hung up above that, right? And so their back muscles would be taut and tight. And then other times they were just on the ground, right? They would be kicked and beaten on the ground. But they would take this whip, 3 to 9 lashes on it, bones and whatnot woven into it. And the goal would be to not hit them with a crack, but to actually lay the whip in such a blunt way with a force that those objects would embed themselves into the body or at least create blunt force trauma. And then they would pull that whip across the back rather than actually like hit it and then come back off. And the goal was to actually create more of like a shredding effect, for lack of a better word. In fact, today, looking back at that Latin word for the flagellum or the scourging, we get our word fillet from that word. I didn't know that, but that makes sense because you actually are like filleting a victim. And they would go from the top of the neck, think about nerve endings, right? And they would go to the top of the shoulders, they'd go all the way down to the bottom of the calf muscles. Then you think about, kind of the trauma that would be inflicted there. And they would do this relentlessly, really till they felt like they were done. You have a mob of people who are already angry. What's their stopping point? Well, sometimes they went too far. Josephus, the historian, tells us that he personally knew victims of Roman flogging. Remember, he was a Jewish soldier before he repented and went with the Romans. He knew flogging victims that had been flogged so severely that it opened up their abdomen to cause their insides to fall out. And I mean to tell you this because this is the nature of what Jesus is going through. And he also tells us that there are certain victims, and another historian tells this too, that bone would be exposed, and that this was the severity of that kind of a flogging. I think it is one of those things where we want to be careful when we're around children, but let's be real when we're with adults. That's the nature of this. And so maybe Mel Gibson's The Passion, I've only seen it once because it's pretty brutal to visualize, but maybe it actually does get at some of that, and it's trying to get at some of that. So I don't know how far they go on this with Jesus. They obviously take him far enough with this flogging that he can't even carry his own cross in just a minute. And so that is kind of step one. If we were going to take today, my goal tonight is to take a journey with Jesus through the crucifixion to the tomb. My students today, we actually took just a 3/4 of a mile walk, and we just took stations and we remembered Jesus. In Jerusalem, it's called the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering. And we wanted to do some of that. Questions about the flogging? Let me pause here and just ask any questions you have about the flogging. Okay. So then we learn in the story, and again, I'm compiling the Gospels together with some of these details. Jesus is forced to carry his own cross. Some things that we know about crosses, you see some of this in your handout, is again, they're not prefabbed. So Romans crucified victims in different ways. There are different shapes of crosses, and they all have different Latin names. There's kind of the uppercase T cross. If you watched, I think it's the old movie Spartacus. Anyone remember that movie back in the day? I think in the movie Spartacus, there's a scene where the slaves who revolted are all crucified, and they line the major Roman highway. They're all on capital T crosses. They're all way up in the sky, which is fairly accurate when it comes to sometimes the shape of crosses. Most historians believe that crosses were typically lower to the ground, though, so that they were more like an in-your-face kind of a thing. But the propaganda was the same. You want to lift yourself up against Rome? Rebel? Lift yourself up and call yourself a king? We'll lift you up. And so they would put these on, like the movie Spartacus, they would put these on major Roman thoroughfares. So this is the road into town. We stopped today on the road into campus and said this is where they would crucify someone if they wanted to make a statement to Ozark students coming on campus. They would put them here, right? They'd put them out by the church sign. They'd put them out by the highway. And they would be somewhat lower to the ground so that you could interact with them. So one of them would be an uppercase T. Typically, the cross that we see Jesus depicted on is a lowercase t. Here's the reason for that. There's something above Jesus' head, right? The sign that says Jesus, King of the Jews, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And that sign's above his head. Typically, that would be posted there. Okay, so traditionally, that is the shape of the cross we depict with Jesus. There are sometimes crosses were actually in more of an X form. And of course, then you just have like crucified victims on like random things. For instance, 70 AD, they ran out of wood when they crucified victims, when Jerusalem was overthrowing the city. So they just started crucifying people like on the city wall. And they just used whatever they could to crucify victims. In the movie The Nativity, you see a crucified victim just hung up in a tree. And again, you go, yeah, you use what you have to on the front of the battlefield. And they would have seen this as a frontier front line. So just on the other side of Israel, similar to how we kind of view it right now, it's kind of a buffer zone between two different worldviews. And that would have been true for Rome back in the day. So the other thing that is then true is when it comes to Jesus carrying the cross, is he carrying this entire structure or is he just carrying this cross beam? And either or can be a possibility. You notice we often depict it one way or the other. I tend to lean just toward him carrying that crossbeam down. But of course, Simon of Cyrene, Mark mentions he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Simon of Cyrene is conscripted. The Roman soldiers had the ability to do this, to say, hey, you carry this, or donkey, I need your donkey. And so Simon of Cyrene is forced to carry this crossbeam, or this cross, the rest of the way. 3/4 of a mile, if he's going from the fortress of Antonia out to what we know as the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We'll talk about that next week. But about 3/4 of a mile or so. So what would it be like if we were to depict walking 3/4 of a mile, having been flogged? What else has been true? He's been up all night. With the high priests and the Jewish leaders, he had his face covered. He was beaten, right? So he's had quite the evening. And let alone having whatever this beam weighs. And all kinds of scholars have held all different kinds of conjectures. The answer is we just really don't know what it would have weighed. I don't know that it matters, right, once you've gone through all of that. Simon of Cyrene, it's interesting. It's possible that we also hear the mention of his family at the end of the book of Romans. It may be, we don't know, that he and his family became Christ followers. That's some of the tradition. There's some evidence of that in the names in Romans chapter 16. That's Mark class, not John class, but that's intriguing to me. There's some church tradition that Pilate's wife became a Christian. I don't know. We don't know. But this is a pretty big event. Here's what I want you to ask around your table, though. Jesus is walking now. It's around 6 in the morning. They don't have a Timex, right? They don't have a watch. And so they use kind of the vague quarters of the day. But it's after sunrise. Pilate's had his trial. He's had enough time to say about Jesus, hand him over to be crucified. It's about 6 in the morning, between 6 and noon. It's a holiday in Jerusalem. If Josephus is right, 1 million to 2 million visitors in the city. But it's kind of early in the day, and it's getting ready to the next day to be Sabbath. So you have to do all your preparations that day. So I want you around your table to just, it's guesswork, but ask. No one knows Jesus was scheduled to be crucified that day. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't on the calendar of the day. And all of a sudden there's this parade. Don't get me wrong, it is a parade. The Romans were throwing a parade to show you that they were the victors, that they were the domineering force. And this parade comes by, and is this familiar to you as a crowd to see this kind of a spectacle, crosses going by, the chaos of that, and then you catch wind that one of these is the same guy that just a week ago they were saying, this is the king coming in on a donkey, peaceful king. So around your tables, I just want you to ask, what is it like in the city as people start to catch wind of this trial that has taken place in this verdict of Jesus, the one who's very popular in town? Okay, around your tables, give you just 30 seconds, 60 seconds, go. One of the things to pay attention to in this story, and I just overhearing some of your conversations, you pick up on this. The reactions would have been varied, right? Like some people are glad that this is happening, and other people, of course, this is a tragedy. So thank you for that. I think it's important for us to be asking that question: Would I have reacted the way that I want to react? Like that's one of the questions I asked with Mark's sermon of myself when it comes to Pilate. I mentioned it last week. Like sometimes I can find myself going, oh, there's a part of me that would at least be tempted to self-protect or be fearful of like pushing away if it's going to inflict harm on me. Would it be, oh, this is someone who's being crucified, I need to distance myself from them, or ooh, gross, whatever that might be. Hide the kids, whatever that might be. So I think we recognize the dynamic that's taking place in town. And I want you to hear, even as we get to the end of like Luke's gospel, there's a lot of confusion in town. At the end of Luke's gospel, there's a guy named Cleopas, a disciple, and another unnamed disciple. And they're still trying to figure out on Resurrection Sunday what all just happened. Right? They did not see this coming. And you know this about the Jewish leaders is the Gospel of John mentions, they didn't want to do this in public. It was all done behind the scenes. And so when it happens, it's done. It's over. Nobody can do anything about it. It's already been done. He's already been flogged. He's already carrying the cross. He's already in Roman jurisdiction. Nothing more to do. And so, when it comes to this journey that goes down the Via Dolorosa, down to the crucifixion, obviously you have that mixed reaction. I did fail to mention, by the way, the simplex version of the cross. It started with just impaling people, right? But then what happens is you continue to experiment and try new things. So I think that, one of the things that you're aware of when it comes to the actual crucifixion of Jesus is that crucifixions were not uniform any more than the shape of the cross was uniform. But there are some things we know. One of the things we know is that, well, let me just ask you, what are some of the things we know about Jesus' crucifixion? What are some of the things the text tells us about the way that Jesus was crucified? These might seem overly simplistic or obvious. Okay, nails were used, okay? So typically Romans would nail, when we see pictures of nails in Jesus' hands, typically it's in the wrist. This would be part of the word hand in Greek. You may have had, and I think I've said this in here, you may have had a teacher before tell you to kind of put your fingers in between those two bones there, and you can kind of push hard. And you'll feel it pretty quick. There's nerve endings that run that part of your arm. It's kind of like the hard wiring of your arm runs through that particular area. But you could also tell that this area would be load-bearing. It wouldn't take much of an engineer to figure out that if you're going to try to create a load-bearing pivot point, that's a pretty good spot, is that you would nail through that particular joint or in between those two particular bones and then hang a victim there. So typically, those who would want to study like the historical dynamics of crucifixion would argue that's kind of where the nails were driven in. Not all victims were crucified with nails. Sometimes they were just hung with ropes. You'll sometimes see this in movies or videos that depict Roman crucifixions. It depended on the purpose. If the Romans wanted you to die more quickly, they would inflict more pain at the flogging and cause you to have more loss of blood as you got to the cross. If they wanted you to last longer, they wouldn't do some of those things. Now, if you're a crucified victim, which one do you want? Right? Kind of just depends. Longest time on the cross, 9 days recorded in history. Okay, typical victim, 72 hours is still a long time when you think about it. That's a typical victim on a cross. So what was the cause of death? This is where medical scientists and medical journals have gotten involved and had conversations. And these journals date, like 1995 or some of the more popular journal articles about this. But one of the reasons for the loss of life would be just like blunt force trauma, loss of blood. You're going to die rather quickly if, your insides are exposed. That doesn't seem to be the case in the 3 victims we see. The long term, 9 days, it's not loss of blood, it's actually exposure. So there's stories, and again, I know I'm erring on the side of being overly detailed, but there's stories in history of crucified victims being eaten by scavengers, right? The birds would come up, birds of prey would come up, or scavengers would come up and peck at them, and especially eyes and soft tissue and some of those kinds of things. Or animals would come up. Remember, they're low to the ground and come up. And that's not the case here. But you're on there for 9 days. You're in the sun. You're being exposed. You're not finding shade. They're giving you things to drink. In fact, Jesus refuses some of the drink. That particular mixture of drink, what we most likely think that it is some sort of an anesthetic to kind of numb the pain, but also then prolongs things and you're not thinking clearly. And so again, it's a deterrent. It's not so much for the person on the cross, it's for everybody else who's seeing this. What does the sign say? Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Right? It's a mockery not just of Jesus now, it's a mockery of the Jewish people. Right? Here's your king. Ha ha ha. No, who's your real king? Right? So that sign is a mockery. That's why the Jewish leaders are like, can you say he claimed to be? And Pilate's like, what I've written. Because he gets the final word. He gets the final jab in. And so this particular moment when it comes to Jesus' crucifixion, we do see nails in his hands. When it comes to nails in the feet, feet were often nailed into crosses different ways. We actually have 2 skeletons that have been, in history, recently discovered of crucified victims. One is a full skeleton. You can get online and Google this. Don't do it right now. But both of them have depictions of nails that are through ankle bones. And I don't mean like through the tendon behind your ankle bone. I mean like through the ankle bone. One of them, in one of the journals, talks about what looks like a misfire, a dent in the ankle bone where they put the nail, hit it, it didn't go through, they moved the nail, hit it again. I've never broken a bone other than tearing my fingers out of joint and breaking fingers, and I don't even know if they were broken or just out of joint. But I know people who have broken bones or had bone cancer, and they've talked about the deep pain, gut-wrenching pain of that. I can't even imagine having a nail driven through, a bone, let alone, my ankle bone. Can't imagine that. The 2 skeletons we have still have the nails in the bone. One of them, the reason is because the end of it, when they nailed it in, it hit a knot or something else, maybe another nail, and it actually curved the end of that nail. So then when they went to pull it out, they couldn't get it back out of the bone. So they just left it in and they buried this person with that particular nail in there. So again, you see that from first century crucifixions. So that is true. Now, when it comes to like where were the ankles, there's, again, no one way that they did this. Sometimes they would, and this is what seems to be true of these 2 skeletons, they would actually take the nails and on the side of the beam, so this is the beam, they would actually nail your ankles to the side of that post. So now, think of it as a pivot point. You're pivoting on these 2 nails that have been nailed through your ankle bones, and you're lifting yourself up on them, and you're pulling yourself up here. And it's not that loss of blood is going to be, unless they flogged you to that point, your cause of death because of these, because you've seen all the stories of someone who was impaled. They don't, the blood coagulates, they don't actually lose a lot of blood until after those are taken out. So the Romans knew these kinds of things. Other times people were nailed and their feet would be sideways against the front of the cross, so they'd be kind of twisted like this. Or oftentimes the way we see it depicted is that there's a little platform and their feet were nailed down into that platform, or that they just stood on that platform and they didn't use nails on their feet at all. And so I just want you to notice those dynamics when it comes to the crucifixion. Part of the medical science then asks this question: what causes the death of Jesus? And medical scientists lean this direction, that Jesus does not last the normal 72 hours, definitely doesn't last the 9 days, dies within 6 hours, is what Mark's gospel will tell us. So when it comes to, within 9 in the morning, to about the 3 in the afternoon. Okay, so in that time frame, Jesus likely suffers from what's called a pulmonary rupture. And I'm not a medical scientist. I'm not by any means, so I don't even have a doctor, right? So this is outside of my sphere of expertise, but this is what I'm told that those who have studied such things would say. Part of their evidence for this would be that when the Romans come and lance the side of Jesus' body with a spear, it says the blood and water poured out. Their goal with that lance would be the same thing a hunter, when they're hunting an animal, knows where the heart's at. You shoot a bullet right here, that's where the bullet goes in. You hit vital organs, the victim's dead. They would lance a victim that way to hit the heart And those who study such things would say the presence of blood and water suggests some sort of a pulmonary rupture. The other thing that suggests that is that Jesus is able to cry out all the way to the point of death. Because the other common cause of death was asphyxiation, where eventually your body just gives up, it pulling up and pushing up on those pivot points, and you lose the ability to breathe. So what we see in the story is that the Roman soldiers come up because the Jewish leaders don't want these crucified victims out there when Sabbath comes and the Holy Week starts for the Feast of Bread. So they ask that the two other thieves have their legs broken. They come to Jesus, he's already dead, so his legs are not broken. Why would you break their legs? Well, because now they can't push themselves up, right? You're deterring that ability to do that. And so these would be then, some of the scientific things that we could look at and say, oh, these are some of the things that Jesus endured. And I'll kind of move on from there. But I do want to notice, that's what it was like. It was not a pretty picture. And I would say this, I actually need at times to look in the mirror of that to recognize that my sin is pretty ugly. And that even if I would look at myself compared to someone else like the Pharisee and the tax collector and say, at least I'm not like them, my sin is still deserving of that. And I actually think I minimize my need for Jesus, but also the price that Jesus paid when I minimize my sin. But when I see my sin accurately in the face of Jesus' crucifixion, I then see his grace accurately as well. So notice I don't want to land there in the ugliness. I actually want to move to the beauty of that, because that is the story of the gospel. But I don't know that you get the gospel unless you get the cross. I don't know that you get it unless you get the price that was paid for that. Of course, it's not all just the physical pain, is it? So Jesus also experiences emotional pain, relational pain. And so we kind of want to move on from the physical pain, but let me just create kind of a pivot point transition and go, are there other questions about just the medical/archaeological side of what it meant to be crucified? Questions about that before we move on? Yeah.
You're referencing them pushing up. Is that so they could breathe?
Yeah, it's so they could breathe. You kind of see this even depicted in movies of, I'm just going to say, victims who are being interrogated in movies, where sometimes they're hung with their hands up, and the same kind of thing happens to where eventually just your muscles inside your diaphragm have struggle breathing or getting full breaths. So it wears you down eventually. Yeah. Yeah.
One interesting thing, dehydration could play because
Yes.
the average human dies after 3 days without water and 72 hours is 3 days.
Yeah, Jesus here, and they do offer him wine mixed with vinegar. They offer him, again, the sponge is also used to clean things. So it's not exactly here's a cup of water, being nice. If it is an anesthesia, it's not for the purpose of being nice. Sometimes it's for the purpose of actually torture and fun and experiment, those kinds of things. But Jesus says, I thirst. I don't know when the last time he had a drink. He's been up late, or he's been up all night. But his body's been beaten. Right? So I also know that this is where we're going next, Jesus' statements on the cross. Thirst is not just physical thirst, but I don't have what I need, right? And Jesus has said plenty of things about, I'm going to be the living water, and I'm going to be Jesus. And here's what I mean to say about that. I don't mean to make it metaphorical. Jesus is experiencing real human pain and emotion and need in this moment, and he has throughout his life. But this moment is kind of a pivotal moment where Jesus is going to experience some things that he's not experienced up till this point. Because of his carrying of our sin, because of that load that's on his shoulders right now. Okay, good. Other questions? Okay, Jesus says 7 things on the cross. These are in your handout. The 7 statements of the cross. These would be maybe things for you to reflect on. Some churches preach on these every Good Friday, and some of you have traditions like that. I don't know if you have a favorite saying on the cross. So a little bit of a different tone. Notice I'm going to move away from kind of the detailed tone to more of the emotional, what's Jesus going through tone, and even kind of the theological tone is where we'll end up. But what are some of your favorite sayings of the cross? And then maybe you tell me why. What's your favorite saying of the cross and why? Anyone want to speak into that? Yeah, so Jesus, and he quotes, chants, or sings, I don't know. Psalm 22, cries out. Psalm 22. It's a song. It's a worship song. But it's a worship song that is, do you have a song like this that's like, it starts out with more of a cry, a plea, or a human emotion, right? I think I've quoted this before, it is well with my soul, right? It's that kind of a human experience that we all share in, tragedy. If you don't know the story of It Is Well With My Soul, look up the story of It Is Well With My Soul as a hymn. But it's that kind of a song, right? I feel forsaken, abandoned, encircled by my enemies. They cast lots for my clothing. Like Jesus is living Psalm 22 out. It's being lived out. He's experiencing it. And here's my question. Does God actually turn his back on his son? Or does Jesus feel like God has forsaken him? Now here's the thing with that song. The song actually says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Yet I believe, summarizing, that you're actually there and I'm going to proclaim your name to all the nations. Like the song is actually a song that says, here's my human experience of what I feel, but what I actually believe in conviction rather than just in emotion is that you are faithful and you're true and you're with me even when the enemies surround me. So my question for you is this. Did Jesus feel like God had abandoned it, or did he feel distance from God? Is that what sin causes in us? Yeah, that's a pretty big thing for Jesus to experience that. Doesn't mean that God did that to him, but he definitely experiences that. Notice the darkness that then comes over the scene. But I also think it's a song, a chant, a prayer, a cry of conviction that says, but God, here's what I know, right? It's a worship song at the same time. And I think you're going to hear that in Jesus' statements, that sometimes they're a cry of human experience, human grief, human pain, and yet they're also like love and expressions of who Jesus is in, kind of the core of his identity. Other expressions that you love, statements, and maybe why. And we'll walk through some of them. Yeah?
Well, when he says, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah.
I always,
Yeah.
what would I say? I'd say, Father, pull their fingernails.
Oh, man. Yeah. Because, we experience far less suffering, and I don't want to minimize anyone's suffering in the room. I just don't know that we know what it means, not just to suffer the physical pain, but also the spiritual pain of this moment, but also then the emotional, relational pain that he has in separation or experiencing separation. I don't know, right? So I don't want to minimize your pain, but also let's not minimize Jesus's. Sometimes we paint Jesus as, less than human. He's fully God and fully man. He's experiencing this. And so when he cries out, Father, forgive them, it becomes a Christian model. We pray the prayer, Father, forgive us as we have forgiven those indebted against us. So, and Jesus, it goes on and says, but, if you don't forgive, you're not forgiven. And he'll tell us parables like this, like the parable of the unforgiving servant who goes out and chokes out the other servant who owes him far less than what the king forgave him of. This becomes a pattern. There's two more stories in the New Testament that echo this same story, where two other disciples said, I want to forgive like Jesus. The first one happens in Acts. It's Stephen. Remember Stephen's story? Acts chapter 7. Stephen is going to be stoned, rocks thrown at him. Saul is there. He's the one who's kind of the head of this moment. And Stephen says, in so many words, summarizing, Father, forgive them. Then it's interesting to me, that same Paul character who was standing at the head of that trial is at the end of his life, and Nero, the emperor, is now going to kill him. And in 2 Timothy, Paul says, Father, forgive them. And in that moment, that story, like that Father, forgive them echo from Stephen to Jesus that's lived out to the end of Paul's life, it honestly brings chills every time I quote it, every time I read it. Because Paul's only able to forgive like that because he's seen someone forgive him like that, who has seen someone forgive him like that. Sometimes your inability to forgive will be sometimes because you've minimized what Jesus actually did, not just for you, but for them. And I need you to hear this about forgiveness. Tim Keller actually pointed this out really well in his book on grace and on forgiveness. Is forgiveness is not because I forgive you because your sin didn't really matter. It's not a big deal. No, it is a big deal. Jesus had to die for it. I forgive you because Jesus is enough, not because whatever this is not a big deal. And so we look to Jesus, not to the person. And it's not that we forget that it happened either, right? It's not that we re-enter into a relationship that's a dangerous, for instance, situation. But it is saying the price was paid already. You don't have to pay any more for it. I don't wish ill upon you because Jesus already took everything that it needs to take to have this forgiven. So that becomes an important statement. Here's the weird thing. Going back to Psalm 22, Paul's last letter, he's also quoting from Psalm 22. He has little echoes. It's the soundtrack of 2 Timothy. And there's all these little soundtracks in there of like being surrounded by enemies and being mocked and being abandoned. Everyone forsake me. Everybody abandoned me. Paul feels the same thing Jesus did on the cross and says, but the Lord stood by me. Father, forgive them. He's reliving out Jesus' crucifixion in his own death as he has people against him. Okay, other sayings or other moments that are wrapped around these sayings that you find intriguing or encouraging to you. What's that?
It's finished.
Yeah, tetelestai is the Greek word. That's what you were saying. Tetelestai is the Greek word in John's gospel. Remember how John's had this clock going the entire time? To his mom first, woman is the translation. Now is not my time, my hour has not yet come. And he would say that again, now my hour has not yet come. And then finally he says, now is the hour. Well, now the word is, it's completed, it's done, it's finished. Right, it's finished. And there is a finality to Jesus has come to do what he came to do. And the price has been paid. Right? I love what Colossians says about it, that the price for our bill has been crucified to the cross. And it's canceled. Our debt is canceled. It's finished. So I love that word. Okay? Other words or other phrases.
What about the it? What is the it?
Yeah, I mean, in John's gospel, I would say everything Jesus came to do to accomplish. Yeah.
From more time, more creation.
Oh, I would go all the way to creation, which is where John went in John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and he wanted to dwell with us. Jesus came and tabernacled amongst us. So Jesus is providing a way for us to tabernacle. Now, of course, the other gospels, let me, get into some of the other gospels. The other gospels have a moment where the temple curtain is torn. And Mark's gospel talks about this torn open word with the same word that's used of heaven being torn open at the baptism of Jesus. Same word. What was going on there in the synoptics? Well, what's going on there is that temple curtain represents separation between us and God. Now, we don't know if it's the outer curtain or the inner curtain, but it doesn't really matter. That curtain symbolizes the same thing. Life out in the world that needs a priest to get into the inside, and that curtain is now rendered void. Same kind of thing is also a symbol of judgment against the temple. We don't need the temple anymore. Jesus cleansed the temple. That's also a symbol against the temple, a sign against the temple. This is going to be temporary. It's not needed anymore. And Hebrews tells us all of that foreshadowed Jesus' sacrifice anyhow. Okay, good. Yeah, we're allowed access because we have a high priest. The other moment I love in this particular gospel, we'll come back to this next week when it comes to the resurrection scene and just the kind of all of the episodes that happen at the end of John's gospel, is this little interaction with Mary, the mother of Jesus, and John the Beloved. It always, and you've heard people say this most likely before, but it always reminds me, even in those final moments, even with all that's going on, Jesus, and I think this would be true for many of you. If you had a final moment, you're going to think about your loved ones as much as you're also going through all of these things spinning through your mind. But Jesus is responsible as the eldest son for his mother and her care. Joseph had likely passed away a long time ago, before Jesus' public ministry. And so Jesus was responsible for her. What he does is he takes that responsibility seriously at the end of his life and makes sure that his mother is taken care of. He passes her on to what would be seen as his closest of kin. Now remember, he's redefined bloodlines. He's actually said, who is my family? Well, my family is actually those who do my Father's will. So the closest of kin is his disciple who happens to be there. It's John. John also had access into the priestly family's courtyard with Peter, but he's standing there, and he seems to be the closest disciple to Jesus, our best friend of Jesus. He's next to him at the table at Passover, and Jesus hands responsibility to him to take care of his mom, Pretty intimate moment in that moment. And I also think we undervalue Mary at times. Notice her faith. Remember when she had Jesus? It was told that, man, this is going to pierce your heart, right? This is going to be hard for you. And I think that some of you have those kinds of experiences of grief to resonate with some of what she may be going through there at that same time as well. And so this intimate scene that unfolds and takes place in this particular moment. Okay, good. Other questions about those statements?
So the disciple that he passed his mother's care on to
Yeah.
was
I believe to be John, son of Zebedee, the writer of John's gospel. Yeah, there are some scholars, I don't agree with them. There are some scholars who argue that there was another John who's a disciple of Jesus who lives in Jerusalem, but it's not John the son of Zebedee. That is John the beloved. Church tradition has long taught that it's John, son of Zebedee. I think the evidence leans that direction. John, at the end of the gospel, is like, this is John who's telling this. Either way, it's a close disciple of Jesus. I lean toward John, the son of Zebedee, brother of James. So if that's true, which I think it is, again, James dies first, John dies very last. I find that intriguing. I don't know that's on purpose. I just find that intriguing. Yeah. Other things about these statements that take place at the cross.
It is finished.
Yeah.
That's such a big statement.
Yeah.
It is finished.
Yeah. One of the things, kind of going back to his statement, one of the things that I try to remind students of when it comes to even forgiveness in the Old Testament, the sacrifices in the temple, what was it that eventually those sacrifices were pointing to? Well, they were pointing to a greater sacrifice. Hebrews tells us that would eventually, all of those sacrifices would lead to this, but this would be actually the thing that dealt with all the sin. They're rolling the sins back to this. So the Old Testament is all pointing to Jesus. Priests and sacrifices and temple, all of that is foreshadowing this and pointing to this. So how is Abraham saved? It's by faith, right? It's by faith in God who does this kind of a thing. Faith is still in Jesus. It's just previous to Jesus. It's looking ahead. The prophets, the Gospels tell us, looked ahead and they saw these kinds of things. We're saved because we look back on this. This is the pivotal moment of history. Both what we call the Old Testament and then we would call the New Testament hinge on this particular moment. Not just because it becomes a new moment in history, but because this is actually what everyone was looking toward when it comes to their faith. They were looking to this kind of a moment. David as the king even, looks to the promise when this would take place. Abraham's promise, the Gentiles, Abe's promise, the Gentiles will be blessed. All the nations will be blessed through this offspring, and then offspring will be as numerous as the stars. All of that is fulfilled in this. And so I think it's important for us to kind of recognize this moment, when even that phrase, it is finished. It's all wrapped up in this. Okay, good. Yeah, other questions, other thoughts before we move on to the burial of Jesus? Okay. So one of the things that John depicts, and we'll just land here briefly, is that with Jesus' legs not being broken, with little details like the little hyssop branch, and is John using a term here? Hyssops are usually not like long branches, they're more like a bush. You would normally not like use this as a vessel, as a tool. But John here is painting a picture as well. And he's showing that Jesus is the sacrificial lamb of Passover. And so you'll notice in your handout, I give you some details. Like the blood is posted on the door. The door just happens to look like this, right? When it comes to that. How does the angel of death pass over? We've identified ourselves as his because of the sacrifice. Like the blood is on our doorpost. John says his legs are not broken. You couldn't break the legs of your sacrificial lamb. That's not what you did. And so over and over again, remember what John the Baptist said about Jesus? At the very beginning of the gospel, a long time ago, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. What day is it? It's Passover. Now, Jesus has already celebrated the Thursday night meal. This is still the day of preparation. That meal would be celebrated still, but this whole event continues. Remember, they didn't actually depict the lamb at the meal. I don't know if they had lamb or not. But it's interesting they didn't even talk about the lamb at the Passover meal in the other Gospels because he was there, right? And so John's Gospel wants to make it clear this is the Passover lamb that causes us freedom from slavery, that causes us to be able to leave this land of oppression and go into the promised land. Okay, so that's really helpful for us. So around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Mark's gospel tells us is the time of Jesus' death. A darkness covers the land from noon till about 3 o'clock. And Mark's gospel depicts that imagery of God. Maybe it's shrouded in sorrow or in judgment, possibly even both. Right? Darkness is a sign of judgment, that God is not happy, not pleased. Maybe even sign of Exodus, right? Darkness over the land of Egypt. So we see that. But about 3 o'clock in the afternoon is when Jesus cries out, and he cries out, "Into your hands I commit my spirit," and then he dies. Right? He cries out. So pulmonary rupture possibility. I want you to notice that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea don't have much time to do what they do next. Because what they do next needs to be done between that 3 o'clock time and about whatever time it gets dark this time of year in Israel. And they're about the same as us when it comes to like sun up, sundown, those, I mean, obviously different time zone, but times of day because of where they are on the globe. So what time does it get dark right now? I don't know that I've paid attention to this much. 7:45, 8 o'clock. Yeah, I usually tell my students 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, just to kind of not over-exaggerate. So they don't have a ton of time. John's gospel tells us, what about Joseph of Arimathea? He was a secret disciple for fear of the Jews. Speaking of the Jewish leaders, they can kick him out of the synagogue. Remember what we said about Nicodemus? He came to Jesus at night, but also he stood up for Jesus, but kind of in the background, shrouded. Remember, this is the guy who came to Jesus at night, John says. So both of these guys have been kind of shrouded in mystery because of self-preservation. They look a little bit like Pilate, if you ask me, right? Passive, keeping Jesus at a distance. I think this moment is one of those where they come out of that. Like, you don't go to the governor and ask for a body of a terrorist cell. And that's overstatement for how they would have viewed Jesus, but a revolutionary. That's how the Romans would have seen him. A rebel. Right? Someone who's trying to cause a revolt, protester that caused a revolt, trying to overthrow the government. So you don't go to the governor, who's not your friend anyhow, because you're connected in the Jewish circles. You don't go to him and ask for a political favor unless you're willing to come out of the darkness into the light and kind of become a public figure in connection with Jesus. I think this is a pretty public and bold move of them. Joseph of Arimathea goes, and they, of course, secure the ability to take Jesus and to bury him. We learn that this tomb that Joseph of Arimathea owns is near the place of crucifixion. It's in a garden, an adjoining garden. That makes sense, actually, because if you're going to have a cemetery, it's already going to be an unclean area if you're Jewish, so you might as well crucify people outside of the cemetery. Doesn't that seem convenient? This is a bad joke, but a true story. In Monticello, Illinois, our nursing home and our hospital and our funeral home were all right next to each other. I was a preacher, did a lot of funerals. So I would just visit people, and I would be like, stage 1 hospital, stage 2 nursing home, stage 3, yeah, we saw you there too. And so, the reality is in this, that's not a surprise that there's a cemetery next to this place where they're going to have victims who need burials. And some crucified victims would be buried, others would just be thrown in mass graves. Jesus has an honorable burial. They take him down, and he's wrapped in linen cloth, cleansed. This is pretty deep. Think about, they had to do this in haste. This is how they would bury most people, by the way. It would be same day. That'd be the sentiment. But 75 pounds of ointment and spices, that's a big deal. And so then he's placed in a brand new tomb, a family tomb. They would carve these out of rock faces. And I've been in one of these first century tombs. It's called Gordon's Tomb. Some of you have been there if you've been to Israel. It's one of the places that some archaeologists would say this is a possible place that is Jesus' tomb. Israel's a little bit confusing like that. Sometimes we're like, this is it. This is the place. And you're like, well, it's just because you want to take my money. So there's some of that. Okay, it's Disneyfied a bit at times. But Gordon's tomb is a legitimate first century tomb. And it would be hewn out of rock, and then inside of the room would be slab tables where bodies would be laying of family members. Of course, no one's in here because Jesus is the first in this tomb. Then after family members died and their bones and body had decomposed and all that are left are bones, they would take those bones and they would put them in a box called an ossuary box. Think of an oversized shoebox. And those boxes would look like a small casket. And then they would carve out little fingers from that main room. Pretend like the palm of my hand is the main room. They'd carve little fingers into the rock from that. And then they would push those little ossuary boxes back into those little holes. And your whole family could be buried in the same spot. We do some similar kinds of things with mausoleums and those kinds of things today. So Jesus is put in this kind of a tomb. First century tombs, a lot of times of wealthy people, would have then a stone that would be rolled in front. What would be the purpose of that stone? Well, to prevent grave robbery, but also scavengers, animals from going in there and dragging out what should not be dragged out. Right? So that would be true as well. So they take Jesus, they prepare his body for burial, they bury him, and they roll that stone in front. And then there's kind of just this silence, right? And that's kind of a bit of where we find ourselves as we get towards, obviously, Good Friday to Saturday. It's kind of just this moment of waiting to see what takes place next. Our goal next week, and then I'll come back and ask questions about the burial process. Our goal next week will be to start on Sunday morning. I love the little phrase, this is where we'll start. I love the little phrase that says, while it was still dark. Tonight's theme was a pretty dark theme. Like, I watched some of your faces, and I'm glad, like my little sledding analogy, which made you all kind of smile a little bit. Not that you all care about me. But that little story and kind of the cringe moment of that story, like I do think it's important for us to remember some of those kinds of things about the crucifixion. It was a dark scene. But I love that phrase in John's gospel, while it was still dark. And so let me kind of devotionally give you something to reflect on this weekend. Our world can be a pretty dark place. And I don't know what your headlines are. I don't know what pain looks like for you right now. I don't know what suffering looks like for you right now. I don't know what feeling distance from God or maybe another person feels like for you right now. But I love about the resurrection story that it takes place in the context where John says, while it was still dark. And so I'll say that to say this. I think Jesus does his best work while it's still dark. And my hope for you this weekend would be that you invite Jesus to do his work in you. And that you reflect on the implications of not just the cross, but of course also then the resurrection. And so next week as we come at the resurrection, we'll do the same thing we did this week. We'll ask the historical, kind of the historian side of it, the technical side. How do we know Jesus historically rose from the dead? And then we'll ask kind of the so what. So I kind of want to land with the so what tonight and then pray. So if Jesus went through all of this and it was for you, the Bible clearly asks us, so how do we not respond out of a sense of we have to earn anything, but out of a sense of adoration and love and appreciation? Like the crucifixion, the cross of Jesus is not just our method of salvation, it's actually then becomes our model of what it looks like to live as saved people. So one of the ways we respond is we actually say, I want to live a life that is a cruciformed or crucified life, where I sacrifice myself out of love for other people. Luke's gospel puts it pretty clearly. He says, when Jesus says this, he says, I want you as disciples to pick up your cross every day and follow me. Sometimes I kind of go, man, Jesus, someday, I don't know, maybe if someone were to like put a gun to my head, I would say, I believe in Jesus, and that would be the end, but I would know, like I stood for you in faith. And Jesus might say to me, yeah, but will you do it like even in the small moments too? When you have to die to yourself, when you have a family and you're being selfish. We die to yourself in a culture where you have to forgive someone who's not like you. You have to learn how to interact with other people who are your neighbors. We have to give to the poor. And what does it look to live like Jesus in a sacrificial, loving, forgiving way every single day? Jesus would say, that's my calling to you as disciples, is to follow me even to the cross. I sang a song when I gave my life to Jesus. It was, I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus, right? Right, the world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back. What I didn't realize when I was 10 years old is that sometimes that cross would be really hard to carry, but honestly worth it. Because Jesus tells us that the way to life, the way to love, is through that cross. And I want to love and I want to live like him. So I just want to challenge you to reflect on that as we go to Friday, of course, then into Sunday. Let me pray for us, we'll be done. Father in heaven, thank you for our opportunity to study this evening. I pray, God, that you'll shine the spotlight on Jesus. God, if we are forgotten, at the end of the day, I pray that we will have done like John the Baptist did, where we will have made Jesus greater, even if it cost us everything. I pray that as we reflect on the cross of Jesus, that it not be something that just brings guilt because of our own sin, but especially that it brings freedom. It is an Exodus story. It is a freedom story. That because of the sacrifice of Jesus, we do not have to be chained to our sin anymore. God, thank you for that forgiveness. God, the enemy sometimes reminds us of our sin that we've already been forgiven of. And I pray that we can just put that out of our past and into his hands. God, I pray that you will help us to respond with thanksgiving and worship because of that. And God, to desire to be obedient and to live in relationship with you, not out of a sense of earning anything, but out of a sense of adoration and recognizing the wisdom of what Jesus taught. God, help us to be Jesus people. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks, friends.
One more week. My dad sang it. It's gut-wrenching, isn't it? That's a good question. They probably, a lot of songs would say they probably have and so it's kind of like saying President Trump was 20 other underlings that he just has to think. I wish you would have asked that in public, because I would have said, yeah, you're probably right. They're the figureheads. So the same thing happens when the centurion asked Jesus to heal his son, and he sends servants to do it. But one of the Gospels said the centurion asked Jesus. Well, actually, his servants asked Jesus, but he sent them to do it, and so he did it. I do think it's probably servants or other people involved around him. Oh, yeah. And even getting all of those collected. Now, Muslims today still practice Eastern burial customs of burying a body right away. So they'll wash the body and bury it the same way. We have embalm bodies now, but that's only since Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln made embalming really popular because they embalmed him and trained. And that made that really, really popular. That made that really, really popular. For them, like, find bunks in the ground, I'm good. So, yeah, thanks, guys. Maybe. Yeah, thanks, guys. It's a good question. How the soldiers do it. They're not going to take much. They have gloves. So they have, yeah. I wonder if they had some of that stuff already in because did they do that same game with the Kings? I mean, they wove it. They had a staff to it. Absolutely. That's just pretty terrible. Even though it's just a area, they actually have people who do the same way that like pilot addresses. Pilot while their servers are taking care of business. Thanks, guys. I have an elders meeting next time. I'm like, oh. Brother, thank you. Okay, nice to meet you.
You guys want good Friday?
Yeah.
Either way, I use like your information
Oh,
with my fourth graders.
well, I hope you did. Good.
It was very timely. I was subbing in the fourth grade, you talked about the
Yeah.
grand pulling tree. And
Oh, yeah.
there's just like a
I was
couple of things
actually
you brought up that I just wasn't aware of before.